There is a quiet tension that appears whenever we compare two things side by side, what we are told and what we can actually see. Most of the time, those two things align perfectly. History explains what we observe, and the evidence supports the story. But every once in a while, the two drift apart. The explanation feels clean and confident, yet the physical evidence seems to tell a slightly different story. And that moment, when observation and narrative begin to diverge, is where curiosity usually begins. Because history is not only written in books, it is also written in stone, in streets, in foundations, and sometimes in the quiet details hiding in old photographs. Across the world, cities preserve traces of their past in ways that historians sometimes struggle to fully explain. We see buildings that appear older than their documented construction dates. We see windows sitting below modern street level. We see buried doorways, sealed tunnels, and fragments of infrastructure that seem to belong to earlier versions of the same city. None of these observations automatically contradict history. Cities evolve, streets rise, buildings are renovated, rebuilt, or repurposed. Over long periods of time, entire districts can change shape, but sometimes the scale of those changes invites a closer look. Take, for example, the strange phenomenon of buried architecture. In many cities, especially those that grew rapidly during the 19th century, entire lower floors of buildings now sit beneath the street. Windows appear at ground level, even though they clearly belong to deeper floors. Decorative stonework disappears into the pavement. The usual explanation is simple. Street levels gradually rose over time. Layers of infrastructure were added. Roads were repaved again and again. Eventually, what had once been ground level became partially underground. And that explanation is often correct. But when you start comparing cities across different countries, something interesting happens. The same architectural pattern appears again and again. Rows of buildings with buried windows, entire entrances that once faced the street, now sealed beneath it. Basements that look suspiciously like former ground floors. In some places, these features stretch across entire blocks, which raises a question that is surprisingly difficult to answer clearly. If street levels rose gradually over centuries, where are the records of these massive transformations? Raising the ground level of an entire district is not a small project. It requires enormous amounts of fill material, extensive labor, and a long period of construction. Such projects usually leave detailed documentation behind. Yet, when researchers search the archives of certain cities, the evidence of these large-scale elevation projects can be strangely limited. Sometimes the records exist, but are fragmented. Sometimes the explanations appear decades after the transformations themselves, and sometimes the physical structures seem to preserve a story that no longer appears in the official narrative. This does not mean history is wrong, but it does remind us that history is incomplete. Another example appears when we examine early photographs from the 19th century. Photography arrived just as many cities were undergoing rapid transformation during the industrial era. The camera suddenly captured places that had existed for centuries but had rarely been documented visually before. When we study these photographs carefully, we sometimes see cities that appear remarkably developed for their time. Large public buildings, complex infrastructure, wide boulevards, and stone architecture that suggest long periods of planning and construction. Yet, the historical narrative often describes those same cities as having grown extremely rapidly during that exact period. Again, this is not impossible. The 19th century was a time of incredible technological change. Railroads, new engineering methods, and industrial materials allowed cities to expand quickly. But when you compare the photographs with the timelines, the pace of development can occasionally feel astonishing. Entire districts appear to emerge almost fully formed within a generation. And that observation leads to a simple but powerful question. What exactly existed before the moment when photography began documenting these cities? Because cameras, rarely capture the beginning of a story. They usually arrive somewhere in the middle. Another layer of this puzzle appears beneath the surface of modern cities. Archaeologists working on subway systems, infrastructure projects, or new building foundations often discover earlier streets hidden below the current ones. In Rome, this is expected. The city is famous for its layers of history. Medieval roads rest on top of ancient Roman ones. Renaissance buildings stand above structures that are thousands of years old. But similar discoveries occur in cities that are not usually considered ancient. In London, excavations have uncovered entire Roman roads buried beneath modern neighborhoods. In New York, construction workers occasionally encounter older foundations and tunnels from earlier phases of the city. In Montreal, parts of the old city remain preserved beneath modern infrastructure. Cities, it turns out, have a habit of building over themselves. And once you realize this, the landscape begins to look different. The ground beneath your feet may contain several earlier versions of the same place. Street by street, foundation by foundation, cities evolve in layers. What we see today is usually just the most recent surface. Personally, I find this perspective both fascinating and humbling. It reminds us that urban history is rarely as simple as a single timeline. It is a process of accumulation. Each generation modifies the environment it inherits, leaving traces that later generations may struggle to interpret. Sometimes those traces are obvious, sometimes they are hidden, and sometimes they create small contradictions between what we are told and what we can physically observe. But those contradictions are not necessarily problems. They are invitations. They encourage us to look closer at the world around us, to notice the details in old photographs, to examine the architecture of familiar buildings, to ask why certain features exist, even when their purpose is no longer obvious. History becomes much more interesting when we allow ourselves to explore these questions, because the truth is that cities are never finished. They are constantly being rewritten. Buildings are demolished and replaced. Streets are raised and lowered. Infrastructure appears, disappears, and reappears again in new forms. Over time, the narrative of a city becomes a layered story where observation and explanation do not always align perfectly. And when that happens, curiosity begins to fill the gap. What we are told gives us one perspective. What we can see offers another. Somewhere between those two perspectives lies the deeper story of how cities truly evolve. And perhaps the most interesting part is that the evidence is still all around us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice it.